Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, no. Mr. Flake, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, no.
Yes.
Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, no. Change the vote.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their vote? Hearing none, the ayes are 54, the nays 41. The nomination is confirmed.
Thank you.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to close the debate on the nomination of Elizabeth A. Walford of New York to be United States District Judge for the Western District of New York, signed by 19 senators.
Pursuant to Rule 22, the chair now directs the clerk to call the roll to ascertain the presence of a quorum.
Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Barrasso, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Fisher, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Hall, Hortman, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Roberts, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Scott, Sessions, Shaheen, Shelby, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden.
Quorum is present. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Elizabeth A. Walford of New York to be United States District Judge for the Western District of New York shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal.
Hey, vote with Cornelia on this
Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman.
Did you get one?
Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown.
If the local
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell.
No. You did give me.
Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran.
No. Actually, no. The other one. No, I'm going to use I'm going to go after that. Unless somebody like you should probably what did you say? They are.
Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Harkin, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Markey, McCaskill, Menendez, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Nevada, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Tester, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Begich? Aye.
No.
Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Hoeven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Paul, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Merkley, Mr. Merkley, aye. Mr. Thune, Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, no.
Anyone wishing to vote or to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 55, the nays are 41. The motion is agreed to. Pursuant to the provisions of S.Res. 15 of the 113th Congress, there will now be up to 2 hours of post-cloture consideration of the nomination, equally divided in the usual form.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
on behalf of the majority, I yield back 57 minutes.
Without objection. The Senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam President. I appreciate 3 minutes to be here on the floor today in support of Landia McCafferty's nomination to the Federal District Court for the District of New Hampshire. If confirmed, Landia will be the first woman to serve on the federal bench in New Hampshire. But it's really not Landia's gender that matters. It's her professional experience and her personal qualities that make her stand out. She has widespread bipartisan support throughout the New Hampshire legal community, and she will make an excellent addition to the Federal District Court in New Hampshire. Landia McCafferty is currently the U.S. Magistrate Judge for the District of New Hampshire. Her federal court experience includes clerking for 2 district court judges and at the First Circuit Court of Appeals. Landia has also prosecuted professional misconduct cases for the New Hampshire Supreme Court Attorney Discipline Office, served as an appellate and trial attorney in the highly regarded New Hampshire Public Defender Program, and worked in private practice as a civil litigator. And Landia is an innovator. As a magistrate judge, she's become a nationally recognized expert and teacher on how to use technology to achieve a more efficient and paperless workflow in the federal court system. She was unanimously rated well qualified by the American Bar Association's Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary, their highest rating. Landia is also active in the legal community outside of the courtroom. For the past decade, she has lectured at continuing legal education seminars on various topics, primarily on legal ethics, and has also presented guest lectures on legal ethics and civil procedure at the University of New Hampshire School of Law.
Madam President, will the Senator yield temporarily?
I will yield.
Thank
I'm almost finished, but I'm happy to yield.
The Senator from Montana.
I very much thank Senator New Hampshire. Chair, Madam President, I thought I'd voted in the last vote. Apparently it was not registered, but had it been registered, I would have voted aye. Thank the Senator.
Thank you.
The Senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, I'm pleased that this morning, after several months, we are finally going to get a chance to vote on Landia McCafferty, who is a well-qualified, non-controversial district court nominee. She has the support of Senator Ayotte, who also represents New Hampshire. I have no doubt that Landia McCafferty will be an outstanding federal district court judge, and I urge my colleagues to support her nomination when the vote comes up this morning. Thank you very much. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Madam President. I rise today to discuss the nomination of Elizabeth Wolford, a nominee to be a U.S. District Judge for the Western District in New York. I'm new here, Madam President. I'm just completing my first year here in the United States Senate. But I believe this nomination gives us all an opportunity to discuss how government is or is not working here in Washington, D.C. I know when I travel the state of Nebraska, which I am back in the state most weekends and put on hundreds of miles, we're a big state, but as I travel the state of Nebraska, people always ask me, how are things going in Washington, Deb? How are you doing in Washington? And I can't help but compare what we do in Nebraska to what we are doing now in Washington, D.C. Because you see, Madam President, in Nebraska we have a pretty unique system. We are a unicameral. We have one House, we are nonpartisan, and we get things done. We have an agenda set up every day in the Nebraska legislature, and we follow that agenda. We have bills listed, we go through those bills, and most importantly, Madam President, we take votes. And as a state senator in the state of Nebraska, I have an opportunity to rise and debate with my colleagues on the issues before us. I have the opportunity to sit at my desk in the chamber in the Nebraska Capitol and be able to write out an amendment, take it up to the desk, and have it discussed. And then, Madam President, to have it voted upon. I believe the Nebraska way is a good example for what we could do here in Washington, because we have so many important issues before us that are not being debated. I'm speaking basically to an empty chamber right now. We aren't debating the big issues before this country. We are not acting upon the big issues that are before this country. And, Madam President, we certainly are not voting on those issues. We have a system here in the United States Senate where amendments are not accepted. That whole concept is very foreign to me. Because, as I said, in Nebraska, we are able to file amendments. We are able to have those amendments voted upon. And we also respect the rights of the minority. For although we may be officially nonpartisan, we do belong to political parties. We have a right to express our views on an issue, to represent our constituents, and to express their concerns. And those rights are respected, they are valued, and they are upheld. I can tell you I had bills that were filibustered in the state, and those filibusters would last, in one case, 16 hours. But in the end, after those views of the minority were expressed, we took a vote on it.
Madam President, Party Leader, would my friend yield for unanimous consent request?
Of course.
I appreciate that very much. I have 5 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have my approval and that of the Republican leader. I ask consent that the request be agreed to. These requests be printed in the record, and I appreciate very much the yielding. I ask the record appear as not interrupted.
Is there objection? Without objection. The senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Madam President. As I was saying, in Nebraska, we take up those issues, defend the rights of our constituents to be heard, because that's what this body should do as well. We should have the rights of all of our constituents be heard and their views be heard. Being from Nebraska, we don't have as many people as some of the other states. But within this body, every senator is equal. Every citizen has equal representation. That is a principle and that is a value that must be respected. And I'm sorry to say I believe we are at a point where that principle, that value, is no longer respected within the United States Senate. I see my colleague from Nebraska is in the chamber, Madam President. I would ask unanimous consent that the senator from Nebraska and I would be able to enter into a colloquy here on the floor.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from Nebraska.
I appreciate the opportunity to enter into this colloquy with my colleague from Nebraska. We have a rather unique experience. For 6 years, I was the governor of Nebraska. And when Senator Fisher was elected to the unicameral, I was actually coming to Washington to be Secretary of Agriculture, so we didn't work together, but we both worked in the same system. Now, I would like to get a legislative perspective about how the Nebraska unicameral works. I saw it from the governor's office, but of course I wasn't on the floor every day. That's not typically what a governor would do, is go to the floor every day. But in Nebraska, it's a pretty Republican state. I think we all recognize that. We know that. It is a nonpartisan unicameral. So not only is it a one-house system, but the senators don't run as Republicans or Democrats. They run on a nonpartisan ticket. Now, I would also say that our voter registration in Nebraska is public record. So, of course, the media, when we would run for office, would always look up what we were registered, or they would ask us. And I don't remember a time, maybe there was a time, but I don't remember a time where Democrats had the majority in the unicameral by their voter registration. I would like the senator from Nebraska to explain how the majority party, Republicans, worked with the minority party in terms of committee assignments, how they would work with the minority party in terms of chairs. Would a member of the minority ever get a chance to be a chair of a committee? How does that work? And I would like you to talk a little bit, if you would, Senator, about how this system works on a day-to-day basis in terms of the relationship between the majority and the minority. Maybe it will be instructive today.
Madam President, I'm so very fortunate to have Senator Johans as the senior senator from Nebraska. He has a wealth of experience as a former governor, as the Secretary of Agriculture, and as a United States Senator. So he has definitely been a mentor to me. And I believe perhaps Nebraska can mentor the United States Senate through the trying times that we're facing right now. As Senator Johans said, we are nonpartisan. We do not caucus. We do not have majority or minority leaders because we are nonpartisan. So we don't have that leadership structure in our state that we have here in the United States Senate. In the state of Nebraska, if you want to be part of leadership, you stand up on the first day of a legislative session. You have to nominate yourself and run for that position. So you would nominate yourself for Speaker. And then we do a secret ballot. It is 25 votes, and you would be Speaker because there's only 49 of us. And then we go through the committees, and we have 14 standing committees. So as chair of the Transportation and Telecommunications Committee, I had to stand up on the floor of the legislature and nominate myself, that's hard to do. That's hard to do. But you nominate yourself, and then your colleagues, your peers, decide who the chairman will be. We had Republicans and Democrats who were committee chairs. And in fact, this past year in the legislature, even though officially there is a majority of Republicans, many of our chairmen, in fact, I think it was the majority, were Democrats. Because you're rewarded for the hard work you do, for your integrity, for your honesty, for being willing to listen to all sides and work with everyone to reach consensus. So it is a unique system. It works for our state. And it's that ability to work with each other to try and build those coalitions so you can get your 25 votes on an issue, on a bill that you have. I think that makes us so very special with regards to other states and also with regards to the United States Senate, because we do work together. And the coalitions change. The coalitions change depending on the issue. You can find allies all across the spectrum. from more liberal members to more conservative members. If you have a good idea that's going to benefit the people of the state, your peers are willing to come forward and work with you on that. I know Senator Johans, as governor, he had to draw up budgets and send those budgets then to the legislature and have our Appropriations Committee go through that process, dealing with his agency heads, and then the Appropriations Committee would bring that package to the floor. And here again, we would debate it. I don't know if the legislature always agreed with Senator Johans during his time as governor, but perhaps he could give us some insight into how we came together on budgets and were able to work through that as well, Madam President.
Madam President, I would love to be able to stand here today and say to my colleague from Nebraska that every time I submitted something to the legislature, they loved it, blessed it, and passed it. But that did not happen. There was a give and take process that would occur. Budget is actually a perfect example. Like this system, the governor of Nebraska gets the first shot. The governor, soon after the legislature goes into session in January of each year, the governor would submit a budget. We have a long session. It's a 90-day session 1 year, and then the next year it's followed by a 60-day session. In the 90-year session, we would do the full budget exercise. Typically, in the 60-day session, we'd do the fine-tuning. It was a biennial budget that would be passed. Well, I quickly learned that if I was going to have any success, whether it was budget or any other initiative, that I had to reach out on an individual basis and convince each senator of the merits of my idea in what I was proposing. This was not a situation where I had the ability to go to the majority leader and say, get your people in line, crush the minority, and pass my budget. That would never happen in Nebraska. It wouldn't happen with the majority. Typically, that would be Republican in Nebraska. And it wouldn't happen with the minority, which is typically Democrat in Nebraska. I always said as governor that most days the one thing that the unicameral could almost unanimously agree upon is that they were mad about something when it came to the governor. But the reality is we worked through these things. There was give and take. There were things that I wanted that I did not get. There were things that I did want that they would have to give in and compromise on, and it never failed. We would pass a budget by the end of the legislative session. I've said many times, looking back on my time as governor, that at the start of the legislative session, the 90-day session, there was one thing I could guarantee to Nebraskans, and that was that by the end of the session, a budget would be passed. The second thing I could guarantee is without gimmicks, that budget would balance. We had a simple philosophy. We wouldn't spend money that we did not have. And number three, I could promise Nebraskans that we would not borrow money to make that budget balance. Because you see, in Nebraska, we are limited by our Constitution. We are only allowed to borrow $100,000, which I'm sure when the Constitution was written many, many decades ago, that was a very handsome sum of money. Today, it doesn't get you very far. So at the end of the day, we had to balance the budget. Now, some of my greatest allies as governor were Democrats. Some people that fought me the hardest on certain things were Republicans. But we had to work through that. I would ask my colleague from Nebraska, do you ever remember a time in the 8 years that you were a Nebraska senator, where you were in a meeting where your Republican colleague said to you, let's figure out a way to silence the minority and get our way on every vote because we've got the majority. We can win every vote if we do that. Let's figure out a way to break the rules so we can change the rules so this minority means nothing anymore in this legislative body when it comes to these issues. I asked my colleague from Nebraska, did that ever happen?
You know, Madam President, the people of Nebraska would never stand for that to happen in our state. As I said, we're very, very proud of our unicameral system and how we are able to work together. Of course we know who's a Republican and who's a Democrat in the Nebraska legislature, but as I said, we're able to cross that aisle, which doesn't exist in Nebraska, by the way. We do not sit separate from each other, but we're able to reach out and work together. We have this system that is so open and so transparent. We work with the governor, or perhaps in Senator Johan's case, not work with the governor on the issues, but we're able to have that dialogue with our chief executive. We are able to have that dialogue with each other. We have a committee process where every bill that's introduced has a public hearing. Any person can walk into the hearing room and come forward and testify before a legislative committee in the state of Nebraska. And senators then have the opportunity to ask questions, to be able to gain more information, not just from people who are invited to come and sit on a panel before a legislative hearing, but from citizens who step forward and are willing to take that time away from their jobs, their families. Some may have to travel a great distance, since we are a very big state, in order to get to the Capitol, to be at a hearing and express their views. And I believe in most cases, at least in my experience, every individual that would come before a legislative hearing in the state of Nebraska was treated with respect. Whether they agreed with the majority of the members on the committee or they had a disagreement. It's a respect for those views that are different from your own that I believe is so very, very valuable as a legislator to be able to hear, to be able to question. And that's why it truly saddens me that we are seeing a rule change here in the United States Senate, where I believe the views of the minority will no longer be considered. It's been my experience here so far, Madam President, that I've been able to have meetings with nominees who are coming before the committees that I sit on to be confirmed. They come to my office, and I'm able to ask them questions. I'm able to express to them the concerns that I have heard from the people in my state and hopefully get answers back from them. But it does give us an opportunity to establish a relationship where we're going to be able to work together in the future. But more importantly, it gives me the opportunity as a United States Senator from Nebraska, who happens to be in the minority, to have that chance to question the nominee for Commerce Secretary. With a rule change now that just requires 51 votes, even as a committee member, Those nominees don't even have to come and introduce themselves to me. That is not fair. It's not fair to the people of my state, because every state's citizens need to be represented here in the United States Senate. That's what's so very, or what used to be, so very special about this body. You know, you look through history, Senator Johans, and I know you're a great student of history. You look through history and you read about the debates that happened on the Senate floor. You know, I remember earlier this year when we were all in the old Senate chamber, and we got to experience that feeling of being open and honest with your colleagues without the cameras going, and truly to be able to air some grievances. I thought that was helpful. It was a very moving experience for me as a new senator to be there. But I think perhaps you agree with me that we have lost that spirit of the old Senate chamber and of the Senate chamber that we're standing in.
Madam President, I remember that night well. It occurred just some months ago. The nuclear option was being threatened. Many had worked very, very hard to avoid that. Keep in mind, the nuclear option wasn't just discovered this year or last year. Senators have known of the nuclear option for a long, long time. We've been down this road before when Republicans were in the majority. And fortunately and wisely so, they backed off. And a group of, I think, 14 United States senators got together and said, you know, we've got to figure out a way to deal with this, and they did. And, you know, they got a lot of criticism. I remember that. I remember that the criticism was that they caved in, they gave in, they compromised, and they shouldn't have compromised, and all of the things that you hear. But at the end of the day, leadership backed off of doing exactly what happened here right before Thanksgiving. Well, that night we went into the old Senate chamber, and anybody who has ever visited that room, you walk in and you feel the history of that place immediately. Some of the great senators in our nation's history have spent time in that room arguing for the great causes of the day. It's a remarkable place. The doors were closed. There was no staff in the room. There was no media in the room. There was no cameras on recording everything that we were saying. This was a meeting of the United States senators who were there to try to figure out if there was a way forward. Now, I won't talk about the specifics of who said what and who said what to who and this, that, and the next thing, but I will tell you about the atmosphere. I found the atmosphere to be extremely tense and uncomfortable, especially at the start of the meeting. We were really hopelessly divided on the issues that we were facing. But the conversation began, and people started making points on all sides of these issues. And, you know, in the context of that meeting and some things that had happened previously, a picture started to come together. The picture was that we had agreed as senators, most of us, not all of us, some had disagreement with what we were doing, that there were certain executive branch appointees that if there was no objection from any senator, they could move forward through the process really unimpeded. Now, if a single senator had an objection and said, wait a second, I've had a dealing with this person or whatever that's very problematic, well, then they've got to go through the whole process. But we set aside hundreds of executive branch appointees, and we said, look, there's just no good reason to force them through this process when there's no objection. Democrats, Republicans, independents shook hands on that, and that became the way we operate today. Another piece of the context was that there was discussion about some things that we could do with the rules. Well, at this very, very lengthy night meeting, like gentlemen and gentlewomen, we shook hands and we had a way forward. Took a while to develop it. Took a while after the meeting to flesh it out. There was give and take, and some were concerned that it didn't embody what we had agreed upon. I personally thought we probably gave too much on our side. But at the end of the day, I thought it made sense as a way forward and to avoid the nuclear option. And we reached an agreement. Like I said, we shook hands. And that put the issue to bed. As I would talk to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, we would say to each other, you know, that was a good meeting. It's only happened twice since I've been here, once on the START Treaty and once on this. And we congratulated each other for finding that way forward. But then we started to hear just a couple of weeks ago that that agreement wasn't holding. Not because either side had violated it, but because all of a sudden the majority, led by Senator Reid, decided that they wanted to revisit this whole thing. I thought we had put the nuclear option in a lockbox, locked it up, and thrown away the key. I thought we had come to agreement as a United States Senate that the damage to our nation and its citizens in employing the nuclear option was too great a price to pay. That's what I came out of that meeting believing. That's what I continued to believe as I talked to my colleagues on the Democrat side of the aisle. So what happened? If the agreement wasn't violated, if people were living by the agreement, and a whole host of nominees had gone through the process, some of which I didn't like a bit, but they got the votes necessary, they were confirmed, they had gone through the process. So what was different about a couple of weeks ago versus when we walked out of that meeting that evening? Well, I'd ask my colleagues' thought on that, but I think I know what that was about. And I'm going to continue to talk about this in the days ahead as we talk about this nuclear option and what it's doing to our country. What happened is this. Obamacare started to roll out. Now, I remember the day that Obamacare was passed. As I said last night, I was sitting in a chair right in front of Senator Fisher. It was my first couple of years here in the United States Senate. What happened before Thanksgiving in the breaking the rules to change the rules reminded me exactly of what happened with Obamacare. The Democrats had the votes. It was a very unusual time in our nation's history. They had 60 senators, and they had the majority in the House, and they had the presidency. And see, under the rules, they could stop debate and pass anything that they wanted to pass. And that Christmas Eve day, I remember feeling like, as a member of the majority or minority, that I was told to sit down and shut up because my viewpoint on Obamacare meant nothing. What mattered that day was raw, sheer political power. They had the 60 votes. I sat there during the roll call vote. I heard every Democrat vote for one of the worst pieces of policy ever passed by this body. And I felt that day like I was told to sit down and shut up. And then a couple of weeks ago, when Obamacare was literally melting down before our eyes, people were being thrown off their insurance plan. They were beginning to realize what the cost of this was going to be. They were beginning to realize that the promise that if you like your plan, you can keep your plan, period, was a political gimmick. It was a lie. And that they were being thrown off their plans, and that they couldn't even get on the website, and all of a sudden, our colleagues on the other side of the aisle begin to realize that their job was at stake. Their numbers were crashing. And all of a sudden, after we shook hands like gentlemen and women, after a very tense meeting, and we implemented what people agreed would be implemented, we came back to revisit the nuclear option. I want to offer one additional thought about what this means. The rules of the United States Senate have been changed on occasion. It's not something you do very often around here, but on occasion they've been changed. The rules contemplate a way to change the rules. 2/3 of the United States senators have to agree to the rules change. So how did this come about? Well, let me explain that. The majority leader asked for a ruling of the chair. Basically, the ruling got to the question of how many votes does it take to confirm somebody. That ruling was appropriately decided, and the majority leader announced, I want to appeal that ruling. And that ruling was, in fact, appealed. How do you successfully appeal a ruling of the chair with a majority vote? And that's exactly what happened. The Democrats fell in line, and I had the same feeling that day before Thanksgiving that I had on that Christmas Eve day when Obamacare was passed. The feeling I had as a member of the minority, the feeling I had was that every single member sitting in those chairs, the majority, the Democrats, were saying to me and to my colleagues, sit down and shut up. I said last night that I have a tremendous amount of respect for a man who served here for many, many years with great distinction, admired by everybody. I got to know him a little bit. He had not passed when I came to the Senate. A gentleman by the name of Bob Byrd, probably the finest historian of the United States Senate, maybe ever. He would come to the floor and talk about the beautiful history of the Senate and this institution and the sacred rights of every individual senator to come here to the floor and argue and make their point, offer an amendment. Under our rules, the amendment doesn't even have to be germane, and get a vote on that. And you know, this beautiful institution worked for over 200 years under that rule, under that philosophy. Unbelievable. It worked through wars. It worked through the 1918 flu pandemic. It worked through attacks on our nation, 9/11 and Pearl Harbor. Somehow, some way, great men and women came into this chamber and figured out a way to make this body work. Until 2 weeks ago, when by sheer political force, the majority pulled out of Pandora's box the nuclear option. Now, I would ask, Madam President, for my colleague from Nebraska to offer her thoughts on this, and as a new member, I look forward to watching you as the senior senator from Nebraska. I'm not running again. What impact is this going to have? How do you implement the desires and wishes and dreams of Nebraskans who elected you and sent you here under circumstances like this? And do you worry that what's going to happen is it won't just stop here? It will be Supreme Court appointments at some point. It will be legislative activity. I'd love to hear those thoughts.
Madam President, in watching the United States Senate before I arrived here and in studying the United States Senate throughout history,